Let's spend a little bit of time talking about the plant kingdom. First of all, what we need to consider is how plants are related. We've looked at this diagram before. We've thought about the idea that these derived traits were important. So what we want to think about today is how we can have plants develop to the point where they could have moved on to land, but then also thrived. Because as you know, flowering plants or angiosperms are absolutely everywhere now, right? So how did they get to be so successful? We think that plants would have started, of course, in the oceans where everything else did, but we think the ancestor to land plants was most likely some sort of what we know as a Bryophyte that would have lived near the shorelines of potentially very small lakes. And so trying to understand how those organisms would have then evolved to the point where they could have potentially dried out and then moved into a much more complex type of organism. So this Chara that I have here for you looks fairly simple, I think, in comparison to most plants you know today, but we do see them as being photosynthetic eukaryotes. So those characteristics become important. The plants have to be photosynthetic, right? We have to look at them by definition in a way that would allow them to be autotrophs and make their own food. We look at them as having interesting characteristics that can adapt. So we've looked before at parasitic plants, we've looked at carnivorous plants. We looked at all of this in our plant diversity, but what I want to think about today and focus on today is simply the evolution of plants. So how did they get to the point where they started out in water as single-celled algae and have now developed into some of the most complex organisms on the planet? So the cell wall is going to be important for us. It's protective, it's structural, but we're also going to have to think about this central vacuole as being critical. We're going to have to deal with water balance. So the first plants that would have arrived on land are plants that are going to still be very, very water dependent. So they're known as bryophytes or mosses. We find them in only wet habitats. Now, you may find them in forests, but they would be found in wooded areas that always remain at least partially moist. They're going to be very, very short plants, very close to the ground. Why is this? Well, they're very short because they have no vascular tissue. If you remember, vascular tissue is critical to move water from the roots up to the leaves. If you don't have any of this vascular tissue, your leaves have to remain in contact with the water on the ground. The other thing, they have swimming sperm. So to reproduce, they have to release these sperm, literally, not spores, sperm. So they swim, right? So we have to have them in an environment that's wet, that those sperm can move around. These are just a couple of different bryophytes, so you can see they're all short regardless. They tend to cover things almost like a carpet and only in areas where we would have very, very wet conditions. We add vascular tissue next. So we go into what we call our seedless vascular plants. So all we're doing to move from a moss to a fern is to add vascular tissue. What is this going to allow? It allows the plant to be taller, okay? So they can have a bigger size, they can be a taller plant, but they are still dependent on water for fertilization. They still have swimming sperm. So even though they can be taller and they could dry out in these areas part of the year, these plants are still dependent on water for reproduction and fertilization. So during at least part of the year, they're going to have to be in wet environments. And that's typically where we find ferns, is in areas that are moist, typically in spring, when they would actually go through their reproduction. but by fall they've dried out. So you see these ferns on the left, they would have been nice and lush green in the spring, but now in the fall they've actually started to change colors like our regular plants that we think of. The reason they need to be in moist environments is they actually have these things known as sori on the underside of their leaves that release the sperm for reproduction. And so when we look at that release, they're going to drop straight down. These are on the underside of the leaves, so they drop straight down to the ground, but then they're going to be dependent on water still to allow those sperm to move around. So those are seedless vascular plants. There are no seeds, there are no spores of any kind, but what we look at instead is the addition of vascular tissue to make the plants taller.